While most people would panic over a break-in, I sat calmly at the airport, waiting for my phone to ring. Because the person breaking into my house right now has no idea she's walking straight into a trap I spent 6 months setting. Welcome to Revenge Mode. Sit back and listen to my story. My name is Tabitha. I am 32 years old, and for the last 6 months, I have been waiting for exactly this moment. Most people panic when they hear their property is being broken into. They scream, they call the police, they rush to the scene. I didn't. I just sat there in the empty departure lounge of the Omaha airport watching the snow bury the runway and waited for the phone to ring. It happened exactly as I predicted. The call came from the storage facility manager, Mr. Henderson. His voice was tight, struggling to be heard over the background noise of wind and shouting. "Tabitha, I didn't want to alarm you," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "But she is here, your stepmother. She's standing right in front of Unit 409. I tightened my grip on the phone. "Is she alone?" "No," Mr. Henderson replied. "She brought a locksmith. And she's making a scene, Tabitha. She is screaming that your father is in the hospital, that he's dying, and that the life insurance policy needed for his surgery is locked inside your unit." I closed my eyes, not in fear but in cold satisfaction. It was a lie, a desperate, calculated lie. "She's telling the locksmith that you hid the papers," Mr. Henderson continued, the panic rising in his voice. "She's shouting that you want your father to die so you can cash out the inheritance early. She's trying to force the locksmith to cut the bolt." "Mr. Henderson," I interrupted, my voice steady, cutting through his panic. "Is the new security camera recording, the high-definition one?" "Yes, it's running, but I should stop her." "No," I said. "Do not stop her. Do not intervene." "But she has bolt cutters. She's going to destroy the lock." "I know," I said, leaning back in the airport chair. "Let her cut it. Let her break the law. Just make sure you get her face when the metal snaps." "Mary, before we see what happens when that lock breaks, I have a question for you. Have you ever had to stay silent and watch someone dig their own grave just to prove the truth? Have you ever had to play the villain to save your family? I'd love to know where you are listening from. Drop your city or country in the comments below. We share stories about justice, patience, and consequences here every day. If you want to see how the greedy get what they deserve, hit that subscribe button and stay with us. To understand why I let her break in and why I was sitting at an airport instead of rushing to stop her, you have to understand that this didn't start with a lock. It didn't start with a lie about life insurance. It started the day my mother died and the day she decided my father was her next target. 2 winters ago, the sprawling Victorian house in the suburbs of Omaha felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum. After my mother's funeral, the warmth evaporated from the hallways, leaving behind a silence so heavy it felt like it could crush bones. My father, George, a man who had once been the loudest laugh in any room, shrank into a ghost of himself. He stopped shaving, stopped opening the curtains, and eventually he stopped eating. I was living in New York City at the time, drowning in audit paperwork, calling him every evening only to hear the hollow, raspy voice of a man waiting to die. That was when Loretta appeared. She did not stumble into our lives by accident. Loretta was a fixture at St. Andrew's, the local church where my parents had been members for 30 years. She ran the soup kitchen, organized the winter coat drives, and sat in the front pew every Sunday with her head bowed in practiced piety. She arrived at our doorstep not with demands, but with tuna casseroles wrapped in aluminum foil and a voice dipped in honey. She told my father she was there on behalf of the grief committee, a comforter sent by the Lord to ensure he wasn't starving in his grief. It worked. God, it worked so well. Loretta didn't just bring food, she brought order. She scrubbed the floors that George had neglected. She opened the drapes to let the Nebraska sun back in. She did the laundry, ironed his shirts, and sat with him for hours listening to him talk about a wife he missed more than his own life. The neighbors, good-hearted people who had been worried sick about my father, began to sing her praises. Mrs. Gable next door told me over the phone that Loretta was a living saint, and that I should be on my knees thanking her for saving him when I was too busy with my career in Manhattan to be there. When I finally flew back to Nebraska for a visit 3 months later, the transformation was jarring. The house smelled of lemon polish and roast beef. George was shaved, dressed in a crisp button-down, and he was smiling. It was a fragile, tentative smile, but it was there. I felt a wave of relief so profound it nearly brought me to tears. I hugged Loretta in the kitchen, thanking her profusely for bringing my father back from the brink. She just patted my hand, her eyes crinkling with a humility that seemed too perfect to be real, and told me she was only doing what any Christian woman would do. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that this was a miracle. But my training as a forensic accountant forces me to look at details that others ignore, and on the second day of my visit I noticed the living room wall. My mother had been a talented ceramic artist. For decades, the built-in oak shelves by the fireplace had displayed her best work: intricate blue-glazed vases and hand-sculpted clay figures. They were the soul of the room. Now the shelves were empty of her art. In their place hung framed certificates of appreciation from the church, all bearing Loretta's name, alongside photos of Loretta handing out turkeys to the poor. When I asked about it, trying to keep my voice casual, Loretta didn't flinch. She placed a hand on George's shoulder and sighed softly. "Oh, honey," she said, looking at me with pity. "The pottery made your father cry every time he looked at it. We packed it away in the boxes to help him heal. We have to look forward, don't we?" George nodded in agreement, his eyes vacant. "She's right, Tabitha. It was too hard." I looked at the wall, at the certificates shining under the track lighting where my mother's legacy used to be, and I felt a cold prickle on the back of my neck. It wasn't just a decoration change, it was a territorial marking. But I looked at my father's calm face and I made the mistake that would cost us everything. I chose his immediate happiness over my gut instinct. I didn't ask to see the boxes. I didn't ask why her awards were the chosen replacement. I simply smiled, complimented the roast, and let the parasite dig her tick-like claws a little deeper. The certificates were only the first crack in the foundation. Over the next year, I watched from 1,500 miles away as Loretta dismantled my father's life piece by piece, not with a sledgehammer, but with the quiet, suffocating persistence of rust. She didn't ban him from seeing his friends. That would have been too obvious, too easy to challenge. Instead, she weaponized her own frailty. Every time George mentioned meeting his old fishing buddies at Carter Lake, Loretta would sigh a long, trembling exhale that seemed to suck the air out of the room. She would press a hand to her chest, her eyes wide with feigned distress, and say, "Of course you should go, George. I'll just stay here and pray. My palpitations don't flare up again. Being alone in this big house, well, it makes me anxious, but I want you to have fun." Guilt is a powerful tether for a man like my father. He would cancel his plans, stay home to make her tea, and slowly the invitations from his friends stopped coming. The phone calls dwindled. His world shrank until it was just the four walls of that house and the woman who controlled the thermostat. Her control over our relationship was even more insidious. When I called from my office in Manhattan, George stopped answering. It was always Loretta who picked up, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "He's napping, dear," she would say at 2 p.m., or, "He's in the garden and can't come to the phone." When I finally did get through to him, usually by calling his cell phone, which she often forgot to charge, he sounded distant. Conversations that used to be about baseball or local politics became strained interrogations. He started asking me strange questions, questions that felt planted. "Are you struggling with money in New York, Tabitha?" he asked one evening. "Loretta says the cost of living there makes people desperate." "I'm fine, Dad," I replied, confused. "I just got a promotion." "Why would you think I'm desperate?" "Oh, just, Loretta mentioned you seemed stressed about the inheritance. She said you asked about the house deed. I froze. I had never mentioned the deed. Not once. Dad, that's a lie. Put her on the phone. She's at Bible study. He snapped, his tone defensive for the first time in his life. And don't call her a liar. She defends you, Tabitha. She tells me you're just young and ambitious, that you can't help being focused on money because of your job. I realized then what she was doing. She wasn't just blocking my calls. She was rewriting my character. In the quiet evenings when they sat together watching television, she was dripping poison into his ear. She was painting a portrait of a greedy, ungrateful daughter who abandoned her aging father to chase a paycheck, a daughter who was only waiting for him to die so she could sell his home. The isolation was surgical. She filtered his mail, tossing my letters into the trash before he saw them, claiming they must have gotten lost. She changed the locks on the front door, for safety, ensuring I couldn't just drop in unannounced. And through it all, she maintained her public mask of the saintly caregiver, telling the neighbors at the grocery store how heartbroken she was that George's daughter never visited, how she was the only one left to care for poor, confused George. It wasn't just his relationships she eroded. It was his confidence. My father had been a structural engineer. He built bridges. Now he hesitated before ordering a pizza. Loretta would correct his memories in casual conversation. No, George, that was Tuesday, not Monday. Or, you told me you didn't like pepperoni anymore, remember? She did it so often with such supreme confidence that he began to doubt his own mind. He stopped trusting his memory. He stopped trusting his judgment. And most fatally, he stopped trusting me. I was losing him not to a disease, but to a narrative written by a woman who wanted to be the only protagonist in his life. I returned to Omaha for Christmas, determined to bridge the distance Loretta had engineered, but the man who opened the front door was barely recognizable. My father, who had once carried me on his shoulders without breaking a sweat, now stood stooped in the doorway, his skin possessing a gray, translucent quality that spoke of long days spent indoors. When he reached out to hug me, his hands trembled so violently that he couldn't quite grip my coat. The holiday dinner was a piece of theater directed entirely by Loretta. She had invited a few remaining neighbors not to celebrate, but to witness her burden. As we sat around the roast turkey, George knocked over his water glass. The spill was minor, a simple accident, but Loretta gasped as if he had set the tablecloth on fire. "Oh, George!" She sighed, rushing to dab at the water while looking apologetically at the guests. "See, this is what I deal with. His motor skills are just fading." She lowered her voice to a stage whisper, ensuring everyone, especially me, could hear. "The doctor says it's early onset Alzheimer's. He forgets where he is. He forgets to eat. I have to manage all the banking now, or he'd sign our savings away to the first telemarketer who calls." The neighbors nodded in sympathetic unison, looking at my father with pity. George just stared at his plate, shame coloring his cheeks, too lethargic to defend himself. But I wasn't looking at him with pity. I was looking at his pupils. They were pinned, tiny black dots, unresponsive to the dim dining room light. I watched his movements. They weren't just clumsy. They were delayed, like a video lagging behind its audio. Alzheimer's causes confusion, yes, but this level of sedation looked chemical. My work in forensic accounting often involves reviewing medical insurance fraud, detecting patterns where unnecessary prescriptions are used to milk insurance companies. I knew what a medicated stupor looked like. Later that night, after Loretta had gone to bed and the house settled into a winter silence, I crept into the master bathroom. My heart hammered against my ribs as I opened the medicine cabinet. It was packed with bottles, but I ignored the vitamins and blood pressure pills, searching for the heavy hitters. I found them pushed to the back. One bottle was a high-dose benzodiazepine, an anti-anxiety medication prescribed for sleep. Next to it was a powerful sedative hypnotic. I checked the dates and the pill counts. According to the instructions, these should never be taken together, and certainly not during the day. but the bottle was nearly empty, far ahead of schedule. I pulled out my phone and calculated the dosage. Loretta was feeding him a cocktail that would knock out a horse. The combination didn't just make him sleepy, it created a condition known as pseudo-dementia. It mimicked every symptom she was publicly crying about: memory loss, confusion, tremors, and cognitive decline. She wasn't caring for a sick husband, she was manufacturing one. The motive clicked into place with terrifying clarity. In Nebraska, to gain guardianship or power of attorney over a spouse without their consent, you need to prove they are incapacitated. You need a doctor to certify they can no longer make decisions. Loretta was chemically inducing his incompetence. She was drugging him into a state of pliability so she could legally seize control of his assets, his pension, and the house, effectively removing his ability to ever say no to her again. She wasn't just killing his spirit, she was preparing to legally erase his existence. Closing the medicine cabinet, I realized that exposing the pills wasn't enough. If I called the police now, Loretta would simply claim it was an accidental dosage error, a mistake made by a tired caregiver. My father, in his current state, would likely defend her, and I would be the jealous daughter exiled from the house forever. To save him, I didn't need a medical debate. I needed a felony. I needed to catch her red-handed in a crime so undeniable that even the best lawyer in Nebraska couldn't spin it. The next morning, I executed the hardest performance of my life. I walked into the kitchen with red, swollen eyes, carrying my suitcase. Loretta was at the stove, her posture tense, waiting for a confrontation. Instead, I gave her a surrender. "I can't do this," I whispered, dropping my bag by the door. "Seeing him like this, it's too painful." "You were right, Loretta. I'm not equipped to handle his decline. He needs you." The tension drained from her shoulders instantly. A smug, predatory satisfaction settled over her face as she poured me a cup of coffee. "Oh, honey, it takes a big person to admit when they're overwhelmed. You're making the right choice for everyone." "I'm changing my flight," I lied, avoiding her eyes to sell the shame. "There's a blizzard warning for tonight, but if I leave now, I can beat the storm to the airport. I just want to go back to New York." The stage was set, but the trap needed bait. During a rushed early dinner, I pulled a weathered manila folder from my bag and set it on the table while I searched for my car keys. I opened it absent-mindedly to check a document, ensuring Loretta could see the bold heading on the top sheet. It was a forgery I had printed on my portable printer overnight, an asset inventory list on my mother's old letterhead. Highlighted in neon yellow was the entry I knew she couldn't resist: Series E bearer bonds. Face value $480,000. Status unregistered. Location Unit 409. Safe. Code: Mom and Dad's wedding date. Bearer bonds are the ghosts of the financial world. Unlike checks or modern transfers, they aren't registered to a name. Whoever physically holds the paper owns the money. They are untraceable, tax-free, and immediate. To a woman who had spent 2 years grifting for small change and control $500,000 in forgotten cash equivalents, was not just tempting. It was irresistible. I stood up, grabbing my coat and keys, leaving the folder sitting on the edge of the dining table. "I think I have everything," I said, glancing at the clock. "If I left any paperwork out, just toss it. It's mostly just old junk from the estate that I never got around to filing." Loretta's eyes were glued to the folder. "Safe travels, Tabitha," she said, her voice tight with suppressed excitement. "Don't worry about a thing here. I'll clean up." I walked out into the biting Omaha wind, tossed my bag into the rental car, and drove away. But I didn't head to the airport. I drove 3 blocks west, pulled into a darkened cul-de-sac, and killed the engine. I watched the GPS tracker on my phone, the one I had slipped into the lining of Loretta's purse 10 minutes ago. I wasn't leaving. I was waiting for the greed to override the caution. And with $480,000 waiting in a storage unit and a blizzard to cover her tracks, I knew I wouldn't be waiting long. From the darkened interior of my rental car parked down the street, I watched Loretta's headlights cut through the swirling snow as she pulled out of the driveway. I gave her a 5-minute head start, then drove straight to the storage facility. Mr. Henderson was waiting for me at the side entrance, his face grim. We didn't speak. We just moved into position. He went to the front office to monitor the cameras, and I slipped into the shadows of the warehouse aisle, crouching behind a stack of industrial shipping pallets just 10 feet from Unit 409. 10 minutes later, the heavy roll-up door at the loading dock rattled open. Loretta entered, shaking snow from her coat, dragging my father by the arm. George stumbled, his feet dragging against the concrete floor, his head lolling on his chest. He looked less like a man and more like a marionette with cut strings. A locksmith, a young man looking annoyed to be out in a blizzard, followed them in, carrying a heavy tool bag. "This is it," Loretta said, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. She pointed to the padlock. "Cut it." The locksmith looked at the lock, then at my father. "Ma'am, like I told you on the phone, I need the owner's authorization. Is this him?" "Yes, this is George," Loretta snapped, shoving my father forward. George blinked blearily, swaying on his feet. "Tell him, George. Tell him to open the unit." My father murmured something unintelligible, his words slurring into a soft groan. The locksmith took a step back, crossing his arms. "He doesn't look lucid, lady. I can't touch that lock unless he gives clear verbal consent or shows me ID. This looks wrong." "He's sick," Loretta shrieked, the sweet, pious facade beginning to crack. "He needs his heart medication inside that unit. Are you going to let a man die because of your red tape?" "If it's a medical emergency, I'll call 911, the locksmith said, reaching for his phone. "No." Loretta lunged forward, grabbing the locksmith's heavy bolt cutters from his open bag. "I don't have time for this." "Hey, put that down!" the locksmith shouted, but he backed away, clearly sensing the danger radiating from her. Loretta didn't care. She marched to the unit, jamming the jaws of the cutter against the hardened steel shackle of the padlock. She strained, her face turning purple with exertion, grunting with a feral intensity. "Open, you damn thing!" she screamed. She turned her head, spitting the words at my father, who was slumping against the corrugated metal wall. "Don't just stand there, you useless old man. Look at you. Pathetic." She squeezed the handles harder, her voice rising to a manic screech. "You think I did all this to wipe your drool for the rest of my life? Sit tight, George. As soon as I get those bonds, I'm dumping you in the cheapest state-run nursing home I can find. I'm done with the smell of old age. I've earned this money." Snap. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet warehouse. The lock broke, falling to the concrete with a metallic clang. Loretta let out a triumphant, breathless laugh, dropping the cutters to reach for the latch. "You certainly earned something, Loretta," I said, my voice cutting through the cold air. "But it isn't money." Loretta froze. She spun around, her eyes bulging as I stepped out from behind the pallets. At the same moment, Mr. Henderson emerged from the hallway, holding his phone up, the red recording light steady and unblinking. "Tabitha," she whispered, the color draining from her face so fast she looked like a corpse. You're at the airport." "I missed my flight," I said, walking closer until I was standing between her and my father. I looked down at the broken lock, then at the piece of paper in her hand with the fake safe code. "And you just broke into a commercial facility, destroyed property, and confessed to elder abuse on camera." Loretta looked at the bolt cutters at her feet, then at the locksmith, who was now dialing the police, and finally at me. The mask didn't just fall, it shattered. For the first time, there was no scripture, no pity, no performance. There was only the naked, terrified realization that the trap had snapped shut, and she was the one inside it. I didn't let the shock of the moment fade. I reached for Mr. Henderson's phone, tapped the screen, and hit replay. Loretta's voice, tinny and shrill, screeched from the speaker, echoing off the metal walls of the storage unit. "I'm dumping you in the cheapest state-run nursing home I can find. I'm done with the smell of old age." I played it again. And then a third time. My father slumped against the corrugated steel, blinked rapidly. The chemical fog of the benzodiazepines was thick, but the adrenaline of betrayal is a powerful antidote. He looked up, his eyes finding Loretta's face, the woman who had spent 2 years cooing scripture verses and spoon-feeding him soup, was now staring at him with the cornered desperation of a trapped rat. Nursing home. George whispered the words, slurring less than before. He pushed himself up, his hand trembling as he pointed a finger at her. You said we were going to travel. You said you loved me. I do, George. I was just angry. Loretta stammered, reaching for him, but he recoiled as if she were a flame. Tabitha is manipulating you. She tricked me. I didn't trick you into holding those bolt cutters, Loretta, I said coldly, opening the heavy leather satchel I had carried in with me. And I certainly didn't trick you into violating the terms of your residency. I pulled out the documents that had been waiting for this exact moment. Not the fake bond inventory, but the very real, very legal property deeds my mother had executed 3 years ago. You assumed, like everyone else, that when Mom died, the house went to Dad, I said, stepping closer so the security camera could capture the papers. But Mom knew about people like you. She left the house to me. Title fee, simple, absolute. Loretta's jaw dropped. That's a lie. We live there. We're married. My father holds a life estate, I corrected, using the precise legal terminology. It means he has the right to live in the property until his death, provided he maintains the asset and commits no waste. That is the legal term for damaging the property or allowing it to be pillaged. I pointed to the broken padlock lying on the concrete. Breaking into the estate's storage unit to steal assets, that is active waste. Attempting to liquidate $500,000 of the remainder man's inheritance. That is a violation of the life estate agreement. The wail of sirens cut through the snowy night, growing louder with every second. The locksmith, who had been quietly packing his tools, looked at Loretta with disgust. I called them lady. I'm not losing my license because you wanted to commit a felony. 2 uniformed officers jogged into the warehouse, shaking snow from their shoulders. Mr. Henderson stepped forward, professional and calm. Officers, we have a break-in, malicious destruction of property, and we have video evidence of attempted grand larceny. It's a misunderstanding. I'm his wife, Loretta shrieked as an officer grabbed her wrist, spinning her around. You're a guest who just wore out her welcome, I said, my voice devoid of pity. Officer, as the owner of the property at 422 Maple Drive, I am formally revoking this woman's permission to enter. If she returns to the house, she is trespassing. She has nowhere to go. Loretta thrashed as the handcuffs clicked, screaming at my father to help her to be a man to stop them. But George didn't move. He stood leaning against the cold metal door of Unit 409, watching the woman who had promised to care for him being read her Miranda rights. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a devastating mixture of heartbreak and clarity. The drugs were still in his system, but the hallucination of his perfect marriage was gone. The silence that descended on the warehouse after the patrol cars pulled away was heavier than the storm outside. I drove my father back to the house on Maple Drive, the place where he had lived for 40 years, but as we walked inside, it no longer felt like a home. It felt like a crime scene. George collapsed onto the living room sofa, burying his face in his hands. The weeping started low and guttural, the sound of a man who had lost his dignity along with his delusions. I didn't know Tabitha, he sobbed, looking up at me with wet, pleading eyes. I was just so lonely. She made me feel important again. You were so far away and I'm just an old man. Please, you have to forgive me. I looked at him and my heart broke, but my resolve hardened like steel. I saw the truth. Then Loretta was a predator, yes, but my father was the open door. His frailty, his desperation for validation, and his willingness to believe a lie rather than face his grief made him dangerous. If I stayed, if I just fixed this and left him here, there would be another Loretta. Or a telemarketer. or a scammer. I couldn't spend the rest of my life guarding a man who refused to lock his own gates. I sat down on the coffee table across from him, keeping my coat on. Dad listened to me closely. He wiped his eyes, sniffing like a child. I have made a deposit at Silver Creek Senior Living. I said, my voice steady. It is the best facility in Omaha. I've paid for 5 years in advance. You will have your own sweet nursing care and meals. You will be safe there. But this is my house, he stammered. No, I said softly. It's my house, and I am selling it. I cannot manage this property from New York, and you cannot live here alone. I need to go back to my life, Dad. I stood up and placed a hand on his shoulder. It was a goodbye, not a comfort. The movers come tomorrow. Don't call me until you are truly lucid, until you are the father I remember, not the man who let a stranger destroy Mom's legacy. I walked to the front door, locked it, and dropped the key into the lockbox I had already set up for the real estate agent. As I stepped out onto the driveway, the blizzard had finally broken. The sky was a piercing, cold blue, utterly clear. I got into my car and didn't look back. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, but as the engine roared to life, I felt the heavy weight of responsibility finally lift from my chest. Some people think that protecting your parents means shielding them from every consequence, giving until you have nothing left. But I learned that day that true protection sometimes looks like a locked door. You cannot save someone who is determined to drown, even if you love them. Sometimes the only way to honor the people you've lost is to fiercely protect the sanity of the ones still living, starting with yourself.